1903.
Yes. Okay, good. Thank you. Very succinct explanation. Let me see. Skylar and some classmates were talking, and they were wondering what the structure of the final was. And I'm glad you asked. I wasn't actually planning to do a final, but if Skylar, you and your classmates want to have one, I'd be happy to arrange that. We could put it to a vote, this being, I see Trevor is about to join us. So, oh, okay. They said they're okay with that. Okay. I'm glad to hear that. So good. So there won't be a final. Just expecting you to remember everything that you have learned. This actually, the real final comes in your long lives ahead as participating citizens in the Republic. So that's the real final, and I won't be around to grade it, but you and your progeny will. So good. Okay. So Marbury versus Madison, and I think we've covered both the history as well as what you are going to need in law school. And it's going to be 54 years, by the way, before the Supreme Court will overturn another act of Congress. And so it is not something that the court does readily. And typically the court, because Marshall recognized that this is an act which could bring the court into great disfavor. That is, it's not a political branch. They don't have the political backing of the American people the way the president does or the Congress does. So, and which is one reason perhaps why Marshall is looking back 15 years or 14 years to an act that will get him out of this political dispute with the Jefferson administration. It doesn't entirely get him out of political disputes with the Jefferson administration. We'll come back to that in a minute. And meanwhile, of course, the Jefferson administration has other issues it is considering other than should William Marbury be a justice of the peace in the District of Columbia. And one, I mentioned last time as I was trying to extol to you the great virtues of the Jefferson administration. And in fact, Jefferson did see his administration very much as the end of history. That is, we will restrain government, leave people free to regulate their own affairs, and there won't be much for us to do. But then there are a number of problems. The Adams administration had solved the big problem of the French crisis. But then as Jefferson took office, there were a couple of others. One was the political crisis, actually in international affairs involving Tripoli. And if you want to know more about the war with Tripoli, I can recommend a couple of very good books on the subject written by an eminent historian, well known to all of you. But the other is a constitutional issue, becomes a constitutional issue. And that is this, that after the 7 Years' War, Spain had transferred its Louisiana territory to France. Well, France had transferred its claim to the Louisiana territory to Spain. And in 1801, Spain had secretly transferred all of this territory back to France. This is everything west of the Mississippi River that is drained by the waters of the Mississippi River. An extensive territory that's mainly inhabited at this point by native people, lots of different native people. The French had established a couple of outposts, one at New Orleans and the other further up the river at St. Louis. And then there were trading posts throughout. And the big interest the United States had in this was in navigating the Mississippi River. And for the Jefferson administration, really the territory that is now, well, it was then Spanish Florida. Jefferson was really interested in Spanish Florida, the area roughly, not what we think of as Florida, the peninsula with, Orlando and Tampa and other places, but the Panhandle, the area roughly between between Tallahassee and actually the Mississippi River. That was West Florida. And the critical thing for the Jefferson administration, for the United States, was this. The rivers that flow into this area, the Apalachicola, the Chattahoochee, the Escambia, and so on, drain this area of Western Georgia and of Alabama that are being increasingly populated by American farmers or cotton producers. It's a story for another day. At the time, most of that area is still inhabited by the Creek Indians, but Georgia has laid claim to much of this territory. Another big case I'll just mention in passing, because this becomes one of the big burning political issues of the period, is this. In the early 1790s, Georgia recognized the importance of all of this Western territory. And I remember one of Georgia's reasons for wanting to ratify the Constitution was to get a federal government that could support Georgia in its wars against the Creeks and the Cherokees, wanting to get the Creeks and the Cherokees out of territory that Georgia claimed. And Georgia claims everything to the Mississippi River. But at the time, all of this territory is not only occupied, but controlled by the Cherokee, the Creek who occupied most of what is today Alabama, and the Chickasaw and the Choctaw, who occupy most of what is today the state of Mississippi. And these groups were known as the civilized tribes because they practiced settled agriculture. They lived in fairly significant towns, and they actually had adopted the same kind of agricultural practices that the Americans had, although they were governed separately, of course. And under the Constitution, under the law of the United States, they are independent people, and the United States had treaty relationships with them. Georgia is claiming the land they live on and wants to get them out of the territory. So I know I'm really making a hash of this really interesting story that is very complicated. It might not be as complicated as I am making it out to be, but let me tell you what happens in Georgia, just so you get a sense of what's going on. In 1794, a group of land companies, mainly from the north, see the real possibilities in this land along the Yazoo River. The Yazoo is a river that flows into the Mississippi River. If you're wondering where exactly in Mississippi, it actually flows in at a place called Yazoo in Mississippi. And it was very fertile. This is a very fertile area. The border between the United States and Spanish Florida had been somewhat in dispute until 1794, when Thomas Pinckney negotiates a treaty with Spain, which sets the northern border of Spanish Florida roughly where the northern border of the state of Florida is today, but draw a line west to the Mississippi River. You know, the border had been in dispute up to the Yazoo River. And so you can see this is actually a great thing for the United States now to have this area as part of its domain, but it's still not part of the domain. It's occupied by the Creek and the Choctaw and Chickasaw. So news of Pinckney's treaty comes back, and the Georgia legislature sees an opportunity, but more so, land speculators see an opportunity here. And a group of land companies form for the purpose of selling this land, title no longer in dispute with Spain. It is, of course, in dispute with the native people, but the expectation is the United States can pay them off, get this land, and then sell it. So we can pay a small amount for the land, and then we can sell it to other people as a form of speculation. This is what land speculation is. Any kind of speculation is. You pay less for something than you sell it for. It's something I hope you have learned before you came to my class. And if you're getting your financial and economic ideas from me, you're in worse shape, and the country's in worse shape than I thought it was. So anyway, in the winter of 1794-95, the Georgia legislature opens its session, and I think they're meeting in Milledgeville at this time. leave it to one of you to say where Georgia's government was meeting. And the town is packed not only with the legislators, but with agents of these land companies. And one agent who comes down is James Wilson, the guy we may remember from the debates over the Constitution. He's now a justice of the Supreme Court, but also someone who sees an opportunity to invest in land when one comes along. And he apparently comes down with a satchel filled with money, as do other of these folks. What they want to do is have the Georgia legislature sell all of this land to these companies. The land, the title hasn't been cleared yet with the Indians, but these companies see, if we have title to the land, we can sell it, and we and the people who buy it also can pressure the United States government to do something to get the Indians out of here. But meanwhile, we who have bought it and then sold it, it's really going to be a bonanza for us. There used to be an expression, a land office business. You open a business of selling land, people will flood in to buy it, not because they want to live on it, but because they want to sell it to others. So anyway, it's a great speculation. Someone calls it a saturnalia of corruption. And apparently every member of the legislature overwhelmingly passes this bill to sell the land to these land companies. And every member who had voted for it was bribed, except for one. I don't know what that guy was doing. He thought it was a good piece of legislation, or he didn't know who to go to get his pockets lined. But anyway, you have this real extraordinary moment as people are rushing to invest in this land so that we then can sell it to someone else. And so Georgia does this. And of course, if you are, by the way, does anyone here have a problem with the Georgia legislature being bribed to sell land that doesn't really belong to them to help enrich a group of speculators like James Wilson, by the way, who's, I don't mean to gossip about James Wilson, but it's at about this time when he's a man in his 50s, I suppose, and he had been widowed for a while. He does come to Boston in this period, and he's at church in Boston one Sunday, and his eye is caught by a young lady in the congregation, and he winds up marrying her. She's 15 at the time, so she's there with her parents. And so she and the justice get married. I see Haley's eyes have just widened at this idea. And so I don't know if that makes us think more or less of Justice Wilson, but he is looking for a way to increase his financial wherewithal by investing in this land. So he is there with his satchel filled with money. And it is something like, I don't know, $250,000 or so that these companies invest in bribing the Georgia legislature. Anyone have any thoughts on this? And or on, yes, Paul, the opportunities you may have as a Supreme Court justice to, anyway, go on, Paul.
I feel like it's just like bad for the Georgia economy because there will be a boom in land sales, but once like the house, like it kind of is like the housing bubble in like 2008. Once like people are like, this land's too expensive, I'm not going to buy it. The entire economy of that land speculation just collapses, and then people are left with the people who are stuck with the land now have useless land that they can't resell.
Okay, that's an interesting idea. On the other hand, our argument would be, and I'm not arguing for this, that ultimately the land will be valuable. And that's always the speculation. And there could come a time when it won't be. But right now, Georgia sees an opportunity to cash in. And the land will increase in value is our expectation once the Indians are cleared from it. And we've been waiting for the federal government to do something about the Indians. They haven't. So we're trying to get something done here. And and by the way, I'm glad Paul is here to be the voice of caution in this, because it is a scheme that's going to enrich us immediately, we hope. But then what happens in the long term? And that's a good question to keep in mind. So does anyone have any, some of you, your screens are dark, and maybe it's because you've set out for Georgia to get a piece of that land because you see a valuable property and an investment you want to get in on. Does anyone have any other issues which would make them, yes, V?
Well, I don't have any issue. For me, based on the times and how um, Americans have at that time captured land, was to business. It was business as usual. See how you can steal it from the Indians, move them off the land, get it as cheap as you can, make a buck, and let me profit from it, and see how I can turn it over. And it was what it was, and we just keep it moving.
Okay, thank you. That very, very well put. So, and I know you're not saying that is your point of view. That's you would be wanting to make a buck and keep it moving. Well, but just simply saying
Oh
that's
no,
the way.
that's just
Yeah. Okay.
how it is. It is
Yeah.
what it
Yeah.
is.
Yeah. I should also point out something else. Georgia also recognized that the land would become even more valuable once it was A, the Indians were off of it, and then B, they knew it would be really valuable for the production of cotton. And in the early 1790s, the state of Georgia, about the same time this is happening, a little bit before, Georgia had a contest to come up with a way of cleaning cotton more efficiently, because cotton was very labor intensive to clean the bolls of cotton. And a clever guy from Connecticut named Eli Whitney does invent a cotton engine, or a cotton gin, which allows cotton to be cleaned much quicker than it had been when you had to pick the seeds out and the pieces of the boll out of the cotton. And the cotton gin not only cleans that stuff out, it straightens the fiber so that they can be spun. So Georgia sees this land will be valuable for cotton production. And now with a cotton gin, we'll be able to produce a lot of cotton on it. So if you see these two things, unlike, Paul was warning, not thinking what the land would be valuable for. I mean, he's used to New England where the land really isn't that productive. This is tremendously productive land, and we know exactly what we can plant on it. Yes, Matt.
So I was going to comment regarding Georgia and their scheme to sell land, make money, is while it is going to generate income for Georgia, I think the main goal is that by having American settlers going off into the frontier, trying to clear the land, make it profitable, but also begin conflict with the Native Americans in the area, will drag the federal government into conflict with the Native tribes, thus allowing Georgia its goal of basically getting a stronger federal government to back them up in their territorial expansion. So it seems like it's just they're encouraging people, knowing that the Native Americans are going to resist, and it'll spark conflict, which then will drag in federal government resources and will eventually lead to the land being taken for Georgia.
Okay, good. Now you could also can see into the future here. Good. Okay, so in Georgia, by the way, there is a reaction. I don't know if the rest of us, the country, is paying much attention to this, but in Georgia, there's actually a reaction. One of the senators from Georgia knew that this treaty was going to happen, so he comes down and say, "Hey, this would be a great thing. Now we know where the border is going to be. We have control of the area, at least until except for the Indians. So why not?" The other senator from Georgia, fellow Senator Jackson, is really outraged at this, and not for the economic reasons you guys have been picking up on, but for the blatant political corruption here, that you have the members of the legislature on the take. And what does this say about representative government? We haven't had a representative government for that long. And now we have one of the first things they do is figure out a way to enrich themselves. So he reacts. He resigns from the United States Senate because he doesn't want to be representing Georgia if the state's filled with these kinds of corrupt clowns. And also, there is a school teacher in Georgia, a school teacher with political ambitions named William Crawford. And Crawford also thinks this is really, it's not just absurd, but it is vile that you have an elected body like the Georgia legislature being so blatantly on the take what kind of a representative government is this when people are using their positions as representatives to enrich themselves? Except, of course, for that one guy who voted for it without enriching himself. But, what does it say? You have the whole legislature practically being bribed. Do you want to be represented by these kinds of people, or are you in line with a satchel filled with money so that they will actually represent you? And between the two of them, Crawford and Senator Jackson, former Senator Jackson, they lead a campaign in Georgia to kick out that legislature. Remember, the legislature is elected every year. New elections the next year, all those guys get voted out of office. New legislature. Crawford is in the new legislature, and they rescind this law. They repeal it. Okay. The Georgia Land Grab Act, it's not what they called it, is repealed. Not only that, they want to make sure there isn't a record of this malfeasance. It's really embarrassing to us as a self-governing state, the state of Georgia, to have one of the first acts of the legislature be this blatant act of corruption. So they actually have someone find all the newspapers and all of the books that carry that offensive piece of legislation, and they cut them out. They cut out the law from the books. And then they bring all of these pieces of paper to the state capitol. I think it's in Milledgeville. Someone might have found out by this point where the Georgia's capital was. And they're going to have a bonfire to burn this so that there won't be a record of the bad thing Georgia has done. And then they think, it's too sacred a thing just to, strike a match, if matches existed then, or rub two sticks together, flint and steel, and set it on fire. So they arrange this at noon. Someone sets a magnifying glass over it, so a beam of light from the sun can come through and light this up and help us to extinguish this blot on the moral record of Georgia from the history books, which may be why none of you has ever heard of this before, the Yazoo land fraud, because the record was erased. Not only erased, it was burned by a beam of light from the sun. And that should make all of us feel better about Georgia, self-government, and so on. And by the way, the new legislature also promptly elects Senator Jackson back to the United States Senate. And Senator Gunn, the guy who had come down and helped get this going, voted out. So Georgia has cleaned her conscience and made us all, I think, feel better about representative government. Except, I should say, by the way, is everyone now feeling better about things now that this won't happen? Trevor's nodding his head. Yes, this is very reassuring to know that Georgia wouldn't let a thing like this stand. Well, here's a problem. I don't want to name any names here. I was going to say, James had gone down to Georgia and bought this land. Then he comes back to Boston, opens a land office here. And lots of folks here had bought land in Mississippi in the Yazoo company or in one of the other land companies set up. And now you find out that this piece of land you bought is worthless. So what do? You hadn't bribed the legislature. You hadn't been a party to all of that. But now you're stuck. Hadn't thought of it that way, had you? We were just celebrating that Georgia got this law off the books, except for those of us who had invested in this land thinking that it was a good investment. And who knows, maybe this is the third or fourth buyer of the land. And suddenly you had paid a lot, initially $25,000 is, I think, what the first selling price was, and it had quadrupled since then. So now Paul was worried about the bubble. I guess this really is the bubble, because now it's worth nothing. Yes, Giovanni.
If you're all the way up in New England, it's probably kind of a pain to go down to Georgia to do this, but I guess you just go to court and sue the state. I think that's really early
Here's
on.
okay, here's another thing. I should have mentioned this. Back in the early 1790s, someone from South Carolina who held some bonds issued by the state of Georgia, and the state of Georgia was going to repay them in paper money, and they said no, and they sued the state of Georgia, and the state of Georgia said you can't sue a state. States cannot be sued. And it doesn't say that in the Constitution, though. So the 11th Amendment to the Constitution, which Georgia had said, hey, you can see the other states getting on board with this. Do we want to be sued? And in fact, Georgia hadn't even sent anyone to argue the case in court when this person sues the state of Georgia. And the other states say, no, we don't want to be able to have anyone come and sue us. So the 11th Amendment to the Constitution says that a state cannot be sued without its permission. It's called sovereign immunity. And so, yeah, I guess you might want to do that. But unfortunately, Georgia had already foreseen that possibility, and the Constitution has been amended, so you can't. Sorry, that's off the table. You have a plan B, Javon?
I do have a plan B.
Good.
My plan B is you petition the federal government to make Georgia do something.
Okay. And yeah, you could. The problem's going to be, of course, Georgia's not going to do anything. And Georgia's going to say, and I'll tell you what Georgia is going to say. Okay, why are we now going to be paying off these speculators, these people who had corrupted the legislature and tried to get what wasn't theirs as a way of enriching themselves? I'm getting a sense that that particular group is not going to be able to win much popular sympathy. The poor folks who had invested in this land, maybe there are some poor widows and orphans who had invested in the land, but it's mainly as people like our friend Wilson and others who have invested in this land. And so, yeah, you could possibly petition the federal government to do something. Actually, I should say, the Jefferson administration recognizes what a big problem this is. Remember, this had started during the, Washington was president, then Adams was president. Now Jefferson is president. And this is a big issue because there are folks saying, we really, we didn't do anything wrong. We just bought land that we thought was good. And then Georgia changes the law. So can Georgia do that? And in fact, this becomes a big argument. One of the people saying Georgia cannot do that is Alexander Hamilton, the publisher of the New York Post. And Hamilton says, no, states cannot, actually, the Constitution says a state cannot impair the obligation of a contract, which is what Georgia has essentially done. And on the other hand, Hamilton's not in a position to do anything other than offer legal advice. And Georgia's not going to listen to Hamilton, certainly. But Jefferson does. Jefferson, by the way, recognizes the importance of the issue. So he appoints a committee in his administration to look into the matter. And the committee consists of the Secretary of State, the Secretary of the Treasury, and the Attorney General, which suggests the Jefferson administration takes this pretty seriously. The problem comes because in the House of Representatives, the leader of the Republican Party is John Randolph of Roanoke. And Randolph is a brilliant and insane politician, literally both senses. He is brilliant and he is also crazy. And he has he has control of the House, mainly because people are really afraid of him, because he will say and do outrageous things. He is the one who described Henry Clay as being like mackerel in the moonlight. He shines and stinks, and other things that were even worse that you could say in Congress because it was not mixed company. So Randolph is not going to do anything to benefit these Yazoo men, these speculators who are trying to enrich themselves by bribing the legislature. So this is really the problem here. And it's going to be a problem really for the first 2 decades or so after the whole thing happens. The Supreme Court will have a decision on it in 1811, but that's getting a little ahead of ourselves. Anyway, Yazoo is one of the big stories on the east bank of the Mississippi River. On the west bank, there's this other story I started telling you about involving Spain and France, and the United States wants access to the Gulf Coast, both by way of the Chattahoochee and the Escambia, but also by way of the Mississippi. And the Mississippi, by the way, also provides access to the Gulf for Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, these other places. And you'll recall back in the 1780s, our friend John Jay had negotiated a treaty with Spain that said, we won't ask about the Mississippi for 25 years. And that had been so unpopular, the treaty was not ratified. And now Jefferson learns that the Spanish governor in New Orleans has said Americans are, yeah, you can bring your stuff down to New Orleans, but you cannot unload it until you have sold it. So you brought a flatboat, say, of hogs down the Mississippi River. You have to keep them on that flatboat till you find someone to buy them. Previously, what you could do is unload your hogs in a stockyard, and then you would get there would be an agent there who would say, okay, speculating on the price of pork, he may pay you something so you could get back to wherever it was you were going. Typically, you would take your money and walk back, because while it's possible to take a flatboat down the Mississippi, it's almost impossible to take one up the Mississippi. So you would then walk back and start over. That is, now you have cash. You can buy more hogs, bring them down the next year, or other things you're bringing to market, gallons of whiskey, or whatever it is you're producing in places like Kentucky or Ohio. Now, the governor in Louisiana says, no, you can't get off the boat until you've sold your stuff, which essentially means New Orleans is off limits to American traders. And Jefferson knows this is a disaster. So he sends some ministers to France to try to arrange to purchase New Orleans and West Florida from the French. Okay, yeah, the Spanish had secretly transferred this to France. There's still a Spanish governor in charge there because it's not a high priority for Napoleon to send someone to be the governor of Louisiana. And incidentally, it wouldn't be the high priority for anyone in France to go to Louisiana to be the governor because it was kind of a miserable place. And so, but Jefferson sees it is a high priority for us to get access to the Mississippi River. So it's one of the first things he does. He sends these ministers and he says, okay, $10 million is our price for that area. Okay. And what it is, the east bank of the Mississippi, which might include New Orleans, and then from that running east toward probably the Apalachicola River. And the agents include Robert Livingston, who is the Lord Chancellor from New York, a very important figure involved. Livingston actually had been on the committee that drafted the Declaration of Independence, and he's a big political player in New York. He also is the guy who inaugurated George Washington as president, so not an insignificant person. The American minister to France is James Monroe. He is part of these negotiations, and here they are. And what they want is to get this stretch of West Florida. Now, meanwhile, things have changed for Napoleon and his conception of how valuable Louisiana is. You know, Louisiana was of negligible value, but France did have a holding in the New World that was very valuable and very important to them. And that's the island of Saint-Domingue, or what now has become the Republic of Haiti. In 1793, during the French Revolution, there had been an uprising in Haiti. Actually, another very complicated story, what happened in Haiti. And by the late 1790s, most of the island is in the hands of the formerly enslaved people, as well as people of mixed race who had been free. and most of the French had been expelled. You know, one of the reasons there was a yellow fever outbreak in Philadelphia in 1793 was because of the refugees from Saint-Domingue coming to get away from the Haitian Revolution. So Haiti, most valuable French possession because it produces sugar. And the French Revolution had triggered an uprising in Haiti. And during the course of it, slavery had ended. Now Napoleon is saying maybe we should actually try to clamp down on the rebellion and reinstall slavery in Haiti. He sends his brother-in-law with an army to Haiti to put down the revolution, and the army succumbs to yellow fever and to the Haitians who are led. Anyone know who is the leader of the Haitian Revolution? I should start asking you questions again since we're off of Yazoo. Yes, James and Trevor.
Louverture, Toussaint Louverture.
Yeah, Toussaint Louverture. Okay, and Toussaint Louverture, leader of the Haitian Revolution. By the way, the Adams administration had sent diplomatic agents to Haiti because they saw Toussaint as someone who could aid them against the French. And Toussaint saw the Americans as someone who could aid him against the French. And also, there had been a lot of American trade with Haiti previously. So Napoleon sees the importance of Haiti, sends an army to put down the Haitian rebellion, and the army fails utterly. And so Napoleon gets these guys from America coming and saying, we'll give you $10 million for New Orleans. And Napoleon knows that Louisiana is of marginal value. The only purpose it might have would be as a provisioning ground for Haiti or Saint-Domingue. If France doesn't have Haiti, there's no reason for France to hold on to Louisiana. On the other hand, the Americans are offering a lot of money. So Napoleon says $15 million, and I'll give you all of Louisiana. This is an extraordinary thing. And actually, this is $11 million is what the Americans are going to have to pay. The rest, the other $4 million, there are French people who owe debts, or Americans who have claims against France, and will say, okay, the rest will cover these claims that we have against you. So these guys think this is a deal too good to waste. So they say yes. They make a treaty with Napoleon. The French will sell Louisiana to the United States for $15 million. And this, you may think, is going to be very good news for the Jefferson administration. But actually, it's not. Does anyone know, by the way, why President Jefferson might think this isn't such a good idea? Yes, Jovan.
Because he doesn't actually have a constitutional ability to buy land, from what he can tell. So
Yeah.
you kind of need to get an amendment for it.
Yeah, that's right. Jefferson he believes in a strict interpretation of the Constitution. That's what their whole political mantra had been in the 1790s. And now they get this treaty that says the United States will buy land by treaty. And Jefferson doesn't think that the United States can do that. And by the way, there are lots of people discussing this. Among the Federalists, the idea is this is a terrible idea to buy Louisiana, because the Federalists, particularly in New England, recognize that the more people who move south and west, the less importance New England will have in the constitutional structure. So you will be dominated by the West. So New England tends not to like to see its power ebbing away. And so politically, they say, no, we don't want to have all this territory added. But constitutionally, they say, yeah, the country can do that. In fact, Alexander Hamilton says, of course, the United States can acquire land by treaty. It's inherent in sovereignty. But remember, Jefferson isn't Hamilton. He is a strict constructionist, and nowhere in the Constitution does it say the federal government can buy land by treaty. So he does, as Giovanni says, propose a constitutional amendment that would allow the United States to buy land? What do you think? Let's suppose we're sitting around the table with President Jefferson, Secretary of State Madison, Secretary of the Treasury Gallatin, and he says, I don't think it's constitutional for us to do this. Let's have a constitutional amendment before we actually sign the treaty. What would you tell him? Yes, Jovan.
That's going to take a really long time to get an amendment, and we can't just leave Napoleon on hold while we go through the entire processes of government.
Well, that's very true. What do you think Napoleon's reaction to this would be, by the way? Is he someone who also would say, yes, I understand you have constitutional scruples about that, and maybe you should wait until you get permission from someone else? No, he's going to change his mind. Okay, so it is going to take a long time. And then Jefferson has another proposal. How about if we say this territory is now incorporated into Tennessee, and Tennessee, being a state, would be able to acquire land? Would that make you happier? I know, I don't see anyone here shaking their head saying, no, this is all a bad idea. Yes, Jovan.
I realize the Tennessee thing is kind of stupid. It's like, well, we can't buy this land, so we're going to give the money to Tennessee, and then Tennessee will buy the land, and then Tennessee will give it to us. It's just a roundabout way to subvert it, which kind of defeats the purpose.
Well, it's not Tennessee might or might not give it to the United States. I mean, it would be Tennessee territory. I'm not. Yes, Paul, you have a thought on this or suggestion for the president?
Yeah, I was just going to say, if the federal government, as Tennessee, if the federal government gave me money and told me to buy this, I wouldn't give them the land back. Like, now I have an expansive territory for my state.
Yeah, it's okay. Well, I'm guessing no one here is from Tennessee wants to speak up one way or another about what Tennessee would do with this territory. Albert Gallatin actually says this would be really a bad idea, and says it would be the same as, you could have Massachusetts annex Cuba, or Rhode Island could annex Bengal, under this kind of idea, which would be ridiculous. It's the fact that they're so far away. And so this is one of the dilemmas. And ultimately they said, okay, we're not going to change the Constitution. We'll just say, we'll ratify the treaty, buy Louisiana. And then the other problem is, can Louisiana be incorporated into the Union as a state? That's another problem. The Federalists really don't like that idea of Louisiana becoming a state. Now, really, for the political reason I mentioned. And B, there's this other issue too. The people in Louisiana, those who are there, who are not Native Americans, speak French. And in fact, Louisiana also has a majority of enslaved people. So yes, Jovan, you have thoughts on this, Louisiana's status?
Yeah, when they say bring in Louisiana as a state, do they mean Louisiana as we think of it now, or Louisiana as in the entire Louisiana territory?
Okay, they probably wouldn't be the entire territory, okay. But and in fact, under the Constitution, there has to be a certain number of people in a territory before it can be admitted as a state. But one thing you want to do, however big it is have some kind of a government in effect. You can't simply keep the same French people who have been running things. I mean, that Spanish guy who shut down the port to the Americans is probably the first one we're going to kick out if he's still around. But you need to have some kind of a government there even before it becomes a state. So this is another issue for the administration, is what kind of a government should Louisiana have? I mean, we like this idea of representative government, but on the other hand, do we really want these people choosing representatives who don't even speak the language and other things? I mean, this is, I'm not downplaying the significance of this issue. And it is really up to the president to determine what kind of a government this territory will have. Previous territories, well, they had been formed out of a state like Kentucky, or they are formed from territory that belonged to the United States. And the custom there is for the president to appoint a governor, sometimes a military officer, sometimes not, and then have some kind of an elective council or an elective assembly to govern the territory. But in Louisiana, what the president does is simply create a governor and a legislative council with 13 members, and the governor and the council are all appointed by the president. So the House of Representatives tries to amend this idea so that the voters in Louisiana actually could choose the members of the council, but the Senate rejects that idea. So you have this argument over Louisiana, which really brings up other arguments about territory, what the status of people in the territories, and so on. But initially, we do create this legislative council for Louisiana with 13 members and a governor. And in 1810, the population of the southern part of this territory is big enough that they can petition for statehood. So Louisiana, as we know it, is admitted to the Union as a state in 1810. The rest of the territory is still governed as a territory with a governor now at St. Louis instead of in Louisiana. So that's essentially it. But it raises these constitutional questions about what is the power of the federal government. And Jefferson signs on somewhat reluctantly to this idea. And later on, he does kind of regret letting this happen without a constitutional amendment. Okay, any other questions on this? Okay, but speaking of constitutional amendments, something else happens in this period, and that is, of course, you'll recall in 1800, there had been a presidential election, and both of the candidates of the Republicans, the candidate for president and the candidate for vice president, got the same number of votes. And so seeing now that we're going to have better party discipline, and it's more likely you are going to have all of the electors from a party voting for the same two people, you're going to constantly have ties. And maybe there will be someone less adept than Albert Gallatin in managing things in the House of Representatives. And maybe the House would use this as an opportunity to put their favorite person in instead of the other. So rather than do that, the Republicans propose a constitutional amendment that says the electors will vote for two people, one to be president and one to be vice president. So the idea you're voting for two people, either one of whom could conceivably be president. Remember, the way the guys who wrote the Constitution imagined it was everyone's going to vote for a person from their state, but we make them vote for someone who's not from their state. And that way we'll have a pool of candidates. But that's not what happened. The political parties had developed and could convince the electors chosen in each state, let's all vote for these same people. So it's not disinterested folks who come together every 4 years and think, gee, who do we know that might be a good president? It's now a party organization. That was something that the people who wrote the Constitution hadn't imagined. And very quickly, party organizations developed so that you did have this tie in 1800. So now we change the system so that instead of voting for two people, you vote for a president and a vice president. Any thoughts on this? Rufus Griswold. Yes, Giovanni.
I like the system a lot more.
You like it a lot more? Okay.
Yeah, I think the whole thing that happened with Aaron Burr and Jefferson looks really bad, and probably shouldn't be a thing that can happen.
Okay.
I think this is a way better system for how to handle it.
It may be. Rufus Griswold, a Federalist from Connecticut, I think actually the last time we saw him, he was brawling on the floor of the House with Matthew Lyon. He thinks this is a bad idea because what he sees is going to happen is the vice president is not going to be selected with any idea to his or her qualifications to administer the government. He said the office will generally be carried into the market to be exchanged for the votes of some large state for president. The only criterion which will be regarded as a qualification for the office of vice president will be the temporary influence of the candidate over the electors of his state. The momentary views of party may perhaps be promoted by such an arrangement, but the permanent interests of the country are sacrificed. So instead of having the vice president being chosen as someone who likely could become president, we want a vice president who can deliver his state to our party in the election. I don't know if Griswold was exaggerating what was going to happen with the office of vice president, but anyway, I'll leave that to you to figure that one out. And so that's change in the way the president is elected. Jovan likes it. Rufus Griswold doesn't. And okay. And by the way, Aaron Burr is not asked to run again with Jefferson in 1804. And instead, the new vice president is George Clinton, the governor of New York, longtime governor of New York. And Clinton has a distinction, I believe, in being, no, he's not the only vice president to serve under two successive presidents, but he does do that. He's still vice president under Madison, and he actually dies in office as vice president. Madison has a distinction you might not be aware of. The only president to have two vice presidents die in office. The first is George Clinton, and the second is Elbridge Gerry. And it's another irony because, of course, Madison, architect of the Constitution, Gerry and Clinton were both anti-federalists. They were, in fact, the leading anti-federalists when Madison was the leading federalist. I don't know what that tells us, but let's turn our attention now to a place we haven't mentioned, and that is New Hampshire. And here is the thing about New Hampshire. There is a federal district court judge in New Hampshire sitting in Portsmouth named John Pickering. And John Pickering had been appointed by President Washington, and he had had a long career on the bench and in New Hampshire politics. And by the early 1800s, Judge Pickering is showing signs of mental instability. I think today it would be called, well, I don't know if it's still called being, well, senility, that was the term it used to be. I don't know what we would say today. Where he wasn't completely rational. And it could be related to his age. It also could be related to the fact that he seems also to have been an alcoholic. I'm saying this guardedly. I had a student a number of years ago who wrote a very nice paper clearing Judge Pickering, saying all of this was a political setup. But Judge Pickering also is doesn't really like Republicans. And if you happen to be a lawyer who is supporting the Republicans, you're not going to do very well in his court. He makes known his feelings. And so, by the way, is there anything that can be done with a federal judge who is out of his mind and drunk? Yes, Jovan.
Can't Congress impeach him and then have him removed?
Well, what is impeachment for? I mean, are there grounds for impeachment in the Constitution?
Like high crimes and misdemeanors.
Well, treason is one, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And is being too old and, by the way, and if at this period we were driving people out of office because they drank too much, there would be a lot of vacant offices in the country. So are these high crimes or misdemeanors?
Well, I was going to say perhaps like drunkenness in office would be, but you made a good point. Yeah.
How can you tell in a lot of cases? I mean, Luther Martin, by the way, becomes one of the leading constitutional lawyers of the day. And there's one case where the Supreme Court has to adjourn because he is too drunk to continue his argument. I mean, he'd be doing okay up till that point. But then they saw he really needed to sober up. So yeah, okay. And by the way, what is this term of a judge? How long do they serve? Yes, Jovan.
I'm pretty sure federal judges serve for life or until they quit.
Well, there's actually a phrase in the Constitution. It's not life. It is.
Well, death.
Yes,
Not sure.
Haley. Haley.
Is it death?
No, that would be a good guess though. It would be, what article of the Constitution would judges be in? I'm seeing 3. I'm seeing Giovanna. Is that 3? Okay, or is that 2? Okay, so I'm looking in section 3. The judges, both of the Supreme and inferior courts, shall hold their offices during good behavior. Okay, so we could, I suppose, argue that Judge Pickering is behaving badly, but then who is it that tells him you're behaving too badly to remain on the bench? And I don't know if you've had any dealings with a person showing these kinds of signs of dementia, but they often don't respond to sweet reason, particularly if they also have taken a few drinks. And you say, it really would be a good idea for you not to hold this job anymore, Professor Allison. You could see the person might not react in the way you might anticipate. So what can we do? And then we come back to the solution Jovan mentioned about an hour ago, which is maybe he could be impeached, which is exactly what happens. The House of Representatives impeaches Judge Pickering. The bar in, that is the legal profession, not the tavern he frequented in Portsmouth, comes down to Washington and presents the evidence, and the House of Representatives finds enough evidence to impeach him, and then he is tried in the Senate. And the senators are very wary of labeling the problems with Judge Pickering as high crimes and misdemeanors. So, by the way, the Senate sits as a court. And how does a court generally vote? If you've ever been on a jury, what are your choices as jurors? Or if you've not been a juror, if, say, you've been a defendant. Yes, Jovan.
Guilty or not guilty?
Guilty or not guilty. The senators don't want to say he is guilty. So they are asked, do you find the charge true? And they will say yes or no. And in fact, 2/3 of the senators find that Judge Pickering is unfit to serve. So he is removed from the bench. Okay, so this is the first impeachment of a federal judge. And you may wonder why I have spent so much time talking about Judge Pickering and the foibles of someone who is too old to be on the bench any longer. And it's because on the same day the Senate votes to remove Judge Pickering, our friend John Randolph in the House of Representatives introduces articles of impeachment against Samuel Chase. And Samuel Chase is an associate justice of the Supreme Court. And Judge Chase also is a man advanced in years, but he's a man of great mental acuity. He's also a signer of the Declaration of Independence. And this is, by the way, is also just 2 months after the Marbury decision. You have Judge Pickering removed from office, and the House of Representatives having introduced to it articles of impeachment against Samuel Chase. And in fact, the grounds for Chase's impeachment had been suggested by President Jefferson. Jefferson had read in a newspaper a charge Chase had issued to a grand jury in Baltimore. Anyway, the judge had said, a grand jury sits to decide if people have committed crimes and they should be charged, not whether they're guilty or not guilty. And his charge to the grand jury was, where law is uncertain, partial, or arbitrary, where justice is not impartially administered, where property is insecure, and the person is liable to insult and violence without redress by law, the people are not free, whatever may be their forms of government. To this situation, I greatly fear we are fast approaching. The late alteration of the federal judiciary by the abolition of the offices of 16 circuit judges. So remember, it was the Judiciary Act of 1802 that eliminated these judgeships. The recent change in our state constitution establishing universal suffrage, that is, removing the property qualification, and the further alteration contemplated in our state judiciary will take away all security for property and personal liberty. The independence of the national judiciary is already shaken to its foundation. The virtue of the people alone can restore it. A republican constitution will sink into a mobocracy, the worst of all possible governments. The modern doctrines of our late reformers, that all men in a state of society are entitled to enjoy equal liberty and equal rights, have brought this mighty mischief upon us. I fear it will rapidly progress until peace and order, freedom and property shall be destroyed. Do you think he's right, by the way, that the country's heading into anarchy? Because you have universal suffrage, you have this attack on the federal judiciary, and this idea that all men in a state of nature are entitled to equal liberty and equal rights. This is really destroying the very foundations of liberty and order. Yes, Paul.
I think it's a tad bit of an exaggeration. I definitely think like the people's criticism of judges and the increase trying to remove judges for just like bad decisions or like unpopular decisions is a bit far, but I don't think we're descending into like complete mob rule where there's no law and order at all. I think that the system is at a place that a turning point that we need to address it, but it's not like at a complete drop off.
Okay. So if you were President Jefferson reading this, and by the way, Chase had also sat in a couple of cases involving the Sedition Act, and he really took offense at the fact that these people had committed sedition. So, by the way, how do you think Chase and Jefferson might get along? Yes, Matt.
Judging from his comments, they probably would not get along very well.
I mean, he yeah, okay, go on.
Well, it seems just like most of Chase's criticisms and also his earlier appalling, or appallment at the Sedition Acts, which Jefferson was very much against those acts, shows that they fundamentally disagree on issues.
Yeah, they do. That's a fundamental disagreement. In fact, Chase is talking about our modern reformers. He really means Jefferson. And so he sees the judiciary as this bulwark against this craziness that is ensuing, brought upon by the Jefferson, the French Revolution, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is why President Jefferson reads this in the newspaper and sends it to Congressman Randolph, the same time that they were impeaching Judge Pickering. He says, well, look at this guy. This guy's essentially making a political speech as part of his charge to the grand jury. I don't know if the grand jury was considering anything about mobocracy or universal suffrage or these other things that were bothering Judge Chase, but he was taking the opportunity of having this captive audience of prospective grand jurors before him to make a political speech. And so Randolph thinks, yeah, this guy really is he can be impeached. By the way, has Judge Chase committed a treason, bribery, or a high crime or misdemeanor? Or has he behaved badly enough to warrant his removal from the bench. Yes, V.
I would say so based on his actions and his words that he had written, because eventually, if he continues down that path, he's eventually will start to sow fear and doubt and create a way to have the people of the United States become anarchists and seditionists and rebel up against everybody based on how he's expressing his personal views as how the country is supposed to be going downhill, which it really isn't completely in the dust.
Okay, good. So you would agree. And so you with John Randolph would be pushing for his impeachment. So anyone else, any thoughts, whether you agree or disagree with Pickering? I'm sorry, Chase, I'm getting them confused. Don't tell the dean. Say, oh, we were just talking about ways to get rid of someone who is too old to be performing his function anymore. So, okay. So the House does impeach Judge Chase. And then the trial goes to the Senate. And unlike Judge Pickering, Justice Chase does get very good legal defense. In fact, Luther Martin is his lawyer. And Martin is one of the best constitutional lawyers of the day, also from Maryland. Both Chase and Martin had been longtime allies in Maryland politics. And John Randolph acts as the counsel for the House of Representatives. And the real thing lying behind this is if Chase is removed from the bench, I think there's a good likelihood you're going to see John Marshall impeached next. Because if Chase is removed, it also means Jefferson gets to appoint someone. And what better way to clear room on the court than by getting rid of the judges appointed by your predecessor? And so that's one of the arguments here, hanging over this particular impeachment of Judge Chase. And Jefferson, by the way, kind of loses interest in the whole thing. Impeachment is too cumbersome a process, and the Senate winds up, a majority of the senators do vote to remove Justice Chase, but not 2/3. So Chase stays on the bench. And thus the administration sees it would be politically difficult to get rid of any other justices. So this will be for a long time the last impeachment of a Supreme Court justice. In fact, the last time there was an impeachment of a Supreme Court justice that went this far. 1960s, there was a threat of impeachment that wound up with the judge resigning. But you can see how impeachment, which was a constitutional tool to protect against treason, bribery, high crimes, and misdemeanors, can be used as a political weapon to get out those you don't like. And in this case, we're talking about federal judges. Judge Pickering is replaced, of course, by a Republican. And then Justice Chase also would have been replaced by a Republican. And so it's, I think, fortunate it doesn't work, because otherwise you would have seen every 4 years or every 8 years impeachments against justices who are running afoul of one side or the other. There's another big story happening that I think we'll have to get back to later on. But let me just say, I mentioned Aaron Burr, dropped from the ticket, and it's somewhat mysterious what happens to him next. In 1805 and 1806, the governors of Kentucky and Ohio had sent messages to the administration saying Burr might be up to something. He seems to be stockpiling out of weapons on an island in the Ohio River, on Blennerhassett Island. And he's talking to a lot of people about possibly forming some kind of a military company. And he's talking to some people about possibly breaking off the Western country from the United States. And Burr is saying that what he's been trying to do is raise this army to go down and seize Mexico and to protect the new western frontier of the United States by securing more territory. But it's unclear. It's ambiguous. What exactly is happening with Aaron Burr out on the frontier? And it's also somewhat ambiguous what can be done about it. And I think it is too big of a story just to leave it at that. So I'll have to, we'll come back on Monday and we'll figure out what exactly Aaron Burr is up to and whether this means the end of the Republic or something else. Okay, so I will see you on Monday and think about Aaron Burr during this time, and we will be able to figure out what exactly happens here. So I'll see you next week.
Thank
Have a
you.
good day, Professor.
Good to see you.
Professor, could I ask you a question?
Sure.
I was just wondering, for